where the last transmission took place 4 years ago, in Sackville. But first of all, we will talk about something different. When you turn into radio, especially into shortwave bands, and your favorite program starts sounding like this, or perhaps also sounds like that, or even worse, like this, then I have good and bad news for you. The good news is your radio isn't effective. The bad news, some dictatorship or regime in the world tries to knock out the human right of freedom of information again by radio jamming, that's distortion of existing radio programs with noise or other methods. Let's talk about this topic that is quite as old as radio itself with Rimantas Plaikis from Lithuania. Rimantas, you are a professional in the shortwave radio business, you are the actor, you are a journalist, and you were the former Minister of Communications in Lithuania. How did it come that you are so interested in the specific field of radio jamming?
Hello, so nice to talk with you. Indeed, I was a radio listener living in the former Soviet Union in Lithuania, and I started to listen to the Western shortwave radio stations starting from 1972 or 73. And at that time, many Western radio stations were jammed in the Soviet Union. There were several types of jamming, usually a simple noise or sometimes music or radio programming, and the listening was quite difficult. You needed to have a lot of patience and knowledge how to catch, how to receive the jam signal. So this experience was quite difficult, and many years later I tried to find more information about radio jamming, and I found some information even in Moscow, in the State Archives of Moscow, and many years later I found that there were jamming stations in 81 towns of the former Soviet Union. So these 81 low-power jammers and plus 13 high-power jammers which covered large territories. And the total power of the radio jamming system in the former Soviet Union was about 40,000 kilowatts. Of course, this topic is already over for me, because if some researchers or scientists would like to continue investigation on radio censorship, they need to go to archives in Moscow, in Russia. But at this point in time, it is impossible to do, because you understand that Russia is closed for foreign scientists, and they are not willing to tell us more about this jamming system. But we need to start from earlier. As far as I know, the jamming started in the 30s. In the Soviet Union, in Germany, and later the jamming system began to quickly develop in 1948. And the BBC and Voice of America started transmissions to the Soviet Union, and especially after 1951 and 1953, when Radio Free Europe and later Radio Liberty started broadcasting to the Soviet Union and to the Eastern European countries.
Can you tell us a bit how this jamming was done technically? Because I could imagine Western broadcasters could easily change the frequency, so jamming was quite years ago.
I can explain that each jamming facility consisted of two parts. One part was the listening or monitoring station, and the second part was the transmitting station. So the people, the radio monitors, listened to shortwave spectrum, to all broadcasting bands, and they had a schedule when Voice of America or Radio Liberty or Deutsche Welle or other stations, BBC London, are broadcasting to the Soviet Union. So these local monitors, for example, in the Baltic states, in Vilnius or in Tallinn or in Riga, they listen to these frequencies at certain times. And if at that time, for example, Deutsche Welle was audible, was available in Vilnius, so then they gave a command to the second center to start the phone. And the method is very simple, just to transmit noise or radio program on the same frequency. The noise was used to jam Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Call Israel, and maybe some other stations, I don't remember exactly. And the radio program called Mayak or Beacon was transmitted, was used for jamming of the Deutsche Welle, BBC, Voice of America, and maybe some other stations. So there were two types of jamming noise. Noise of jamming signals, noise or music, or radio programming.
You told in the beginning that you were a listener of shortwave radio in the USSR yourself. How successful, from your point of view, was the jamming? Could really nothing be heard from the Western programming in the USSR?
It was possible to listen because there were two periods from 1963 till 1968, and later from 1973 till 1980, when the Soviet Union not jammed the BBC London, Deutsche Welle and Voice of America. So at that time, all jamming facilities were mostly concentrated on the main, so to say, enemy station, which was, of course, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. So at that time, when I started to listen in 1972, so the voices from UK, I mean BBC London and Deutsche Welle and Voice of America were not jammed at all. But at other times, the jamming was, destroying all possible stations which were transmitting to the Soviet Union, except Radio Vatican, except Radio Sweden, except Radio Paris or international broadcasting from France, and maybe some religious stations. But the main jamming targets always were Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, BBC, Call Israel, Radio Beijing from China, and Radio Tirana from Albania. So there were 6 or 7 main radio jamming targets.
The Soviet Union has passed away 25 years ago, but jamming is still alive, I think, yeah?
Oh yeah. So you can listen to the short waves, and you can listen, you can hear jamming sounds, and the main jamming countries are, of course, China, and Cuba, and Iran, and Vietnam, and probably North Korea. Yes, so these 4 main countries which still jam foreign radio programming.
You wrote a book about jamming some years ago, and you also made a film documentary about radio jamming. Where does this fascination come from?
Well, you know that the jamming, the listening experience was quite difficult, and I just tried to collect facts and opinions, and yes, I wrote a book in English language, which is called Jamming. I have written it in 1998, I think. Later we did a website, www.freerutube.info, and also a 50 minutes English language documentary film, which is called Empire of Noise. I felt that it is my obligation to tell more for people who are listening to radio what was jamming, how this radio censorship was operating, and this was my personal choice to tell people more about radio jamming.
Thanks for the information, Rimantas Plaikys, the ex-journalist and former communications minister of Lithuania.
Thank you very much for your call. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And if you want to get more information about radio jamming, have a look at www.radiojamming.info.
Now, on behalf of all of us, let me express to you a most sincere thank you for our small but highly dedicated team, and so for all of us, thank you so much, and goodbye.
These were the last words of Mark Montgomery of Radio Canada International, who said this in 2012, just before the closure of the international broadcaster. 2 years after, the transmission site from where Radio Canada International was coming from was dismantled, scrapped, and everything is away now. Amanda Dawn Christie is a film artist who made a documentary about this transmission site, and the film starts tonight in Sackville, the place where the last transmission came from 4 years ago. Let's talk to her. Amanda, how did it come from the idea to make a documentation about Sackville to reality?
Well, when I started working on this project, there was no news that the site would be coming down at all. It began as actually as a sculpture project. I'm an artist, and I had built a small radio out of a toilet paper tube, and I'd heard Italian radio and out of my little, very small radio, and I thought I did a good job. And it turned out that no, I just happened to be really close to the shortwave transmission site in Sackville that was broadcasting international shortwave. And I heard that local people in Sackville would sometimes hear the radio out of household appliances. If you lived within a 50-kilometer radius of those towers, houses with copper plumbing might sometimes pick up the pipe would act like an antenna, and you'd have some audio coming out of the sink. And I was jealous because my sink didn't play the radio. So I built a sculpture based on the schematics of a foxhole radio translated into plumbing using copper pipe instead of wire. So for a few years I had this radio sink that I would take on the marsh trying to hear the radio. And the more I did that, in the town of Sackville is pretty small, and locals began to see me as this kind of town character and would start offering their own personal stories about the site, either people who had heard the radio in strange places, or people who worked there, people who listened when they were overseas. And these unsolicited stories were amazing, and so I started doing sound recordings to gather the stories, and eventually I thought I should really make a film. And it began as an idea for a landscape film. I was going to film the towers over 4 seasons, and the idea for the film was that the soundtrack would be more like a radio documentary or a radio broadcast where you would hear the people talking and sharing their relationship with the towers, but you wouldn't see them. You would be looking at the landscape, so you'd be looking at where the transmissions were coming from. And it was only after I started making the film that they then announced the site was coming down. And so I extended my project to make sure to include that as the final chapter, a very sad chapter at the end of the film.
People told you the radio was coming out of the sink. Did you make this experience also on your own, or was it just more hearsay?
No, I never personally experienced it. So it was, and most of what I heard from stories were that this was more frequent in the 1950s and 1960s. They did some work on shielding later on so that it was less frequent. It definitely still happened a lot, and I definitely experienced it over PA systems. If a band was playing in a bar in Sackville, guitar amplifiers, computer speakers, telephones, that was still quite common. But the radio coming out of sinks and refrigerators, toasters, clotheslines, those were all stories from the 1950s through 1970s. And so in the film, I leave that as more anecdotal. It's not the main part of the film, it's a part. Local people who had those experiences sharing their own stories, and yeah.
And what was the weirdest thing people told you?
The strangest would be there. At one point, there was a farm that was very close to the site, incredibly close, only about 200 feet from the site. Later on, CBC bought that house because they were too close. And in that house, the lights would sometimes come on. There would be no necessarily radio coming out, but they would just, when they started transmitting, I believe it was when they transmitted to Africa, the lights in the house would just come up and glow. And also, I believe it was the house next to that one, when the woman would put her clothes on the laundry line, when she would send the line out, when it was rolling over the wheel, you would hear the radio on her clothesline. So eventually, I believe in the 1960s or 70s, CBC bought those houses and tore them down because they were a little bit too close to the transmission station.
That sounds spooky. You were many years active in filming the site. What was the feeling working so long on a project, knowing that the main actor, in this case the transmission site, will die at the end of the film?
Well, the longer I worked on the project, definitely, the more connection I built, the more I learned about the site, the stronger my personal political views about it grew. But also on a personal and emotional level, it's amazing how these kind of inanimate objects and technological industrial structures can almost be anthropomorphized and take on this very personal connection. When I was filming, there were 2 years of waiting for the demolition where nothing was happening. So instead of filming, I would do contact microphone recordings, and I would hike into the marsh, and I would clamp my handmade microphones onto the towers, and they're 400 feet tall, so their vibrations in the wind were like giant guitar strings. And I would spend days on end doing this, and each tower seemed to have its own voice. Like, I would have my headphones on, and I would be alone in the marsh on this transmission site. I mean, it wasn't operating, so it was safe. There was no more high voltage. But I was alone with these towers, listening to these sounds that weren't audible to the human ear. The contact microphone turns touch and vibration into sound, so if I took my headphones off, I just heard, the wind or the crickets. But when my headphones were on, I heard these beautiful drones. And each tower seemed to have its own voice and its own characteristics. And so for me, all of a sudden, each one sounds crazy, but each one almost began to have its own personality. And so then I obsessively started photographing not the panoramic landscapes that most people did, but I was trying to single them out and do portraits of each tower separated from the group. And so when they started falling, it was actually quite emotional for me to see them fall, not just from a political standpoint of the importance of shortwave radio in terms of communication, but for somehow these big metallic technological industrial objects had sort of taken on a life for me, and so that was weird. And also the entire landscape of the area changed completely when they were gone. Some local residents I talked to afterwards when I interviewed for the film, one of them talked about how, Sackville is below sea level. It's a very flat marsh landscape, and when you have 13 massive towers across the marsh with those red lights, it's a landmark, so when you're coming home, you see that, and you know that you're almost home. And one man I interviewed got rather emotional and said, how do I know I'm home now?
You took your footage on 35mm celluloid film, not in a digital format, so it's quite vintage. Was there a specific reason why you chose this?
Well, I personally don't see it as a vintage format, although that was the other challenge, because that really started disappearing at the same time as they announced the towers were coming down. All of my film practice has been on celluloid. I work mostly in 16mm, although I have done some 35 before this one. I work a lot very materially with film. I often hand process it myself in the darkroom, and I work with the structure of the film. For me, I feel like when I'm shooting film, I'm much more conscious of the decisions I make. I find digital video making, people tend to shoot too much. They'll be like, I'll fix it later in post. And you wind up with a lot of mediocre footage. When you have a camera that weighs more than 50 pounds, and you're shooting a limited amount of film stock that you have to send to a lab to be processed, you don't shoot unless the shot is perfect. And I really like that discipline that I have to really consider my shots. It is also a bit of a physical endurance performance. A lot of my filming I did alone. There was 48 days of filming. I had a small crew of 3 people for maybe 6 or 7 days, but for most of it I was all alone with a 50-pound camera and a whole lot of boxes of gear in the snow in the marsh. So physically it was grueling. So maybe I'm a sucker for punishment, I don't know. But yeah, and so when I started, there were still a lot of people working in film, and in 2012 was the year that they, a lot of the Hollywood studios stopped putting out film prints. Kodak declared bankruptcy protection. Empire Theaters stopped showing film and only DCP. And at first I thought, this won't affect me. I'm an experimental filmmaker. I don't care about Hollywood or big movie theaters. But then the film labs, when I contacted Technicolor, they were like, you haven't bought your film yet, have you? Because we're shutting down our lab in 2 weeks. And I thought, oh no, yeah, I do have like a lot of film in a freezer full of it. So at first I had to figure out my workflow, and I decided to still shoot on film, but I still shot everything on film. And just as I finished my workflow, that very week was the week that they announced that they were tearing the site down. And I thought, oh my God, I'm losing my subject and my material at the same time. So filming a dying structure or medium with a dying medium, it made the project take on a very different a different level of intensity.
You already showed film several times at film festivals. Tonight at Sequel, as I already mentioned it. What did the audience say so far about the documentary?
Yes, yeah, I'm very pleased with the reaction. So far, it's only officially screened twice in Canada. I did have one work-in-progress screening in New York, and I was surprised that that audience, who had no connection with this landscape, responded very positively. Many people have said that they wound up with some tears at the demolition scene, which, to cry over technology is, I think, quite a feat. In Canada, it just screened last week at a French Film Festival, and it won the prize for Best Documentaries, so that was very exciting. They had a very positive response from the audience. These stories, like the first hour and a half of the film, you hear stories, personal stories from people who live around the site, people who worked around the site, everything from serious technological discussions of how it works to more fantastical theories of some locals who think the towers make them dream in other languages, to personal stories about, there's a couple who had their first dates under those radio towers. So I spend the first hour and a half of the film trying to build up a relationship with the towers so that the viewers in the audience, I don't want them to feel like students. I'm not trying to teach anything or to be an authority. I'm trying to let the viewers or listeners be more like witnesses, so that they can feel like they too lived in that town and that they too had a relationship with these towers. And then at the point when the demolition comes, the last half hour of the film, no one speaks. And so then the viewers or listeners become witnesses and simply witness the end. And in the soundtrack, what I do at the that last half hour, the soundtrack is the contact microphone recordings I made, the drones of all of the towers. And so at the beginning, it's like this very dynamic choir of drones, because there's all 13 towers you're hearing. And each time a tower falls, you hear it crash down, and I remove its voice or its drone from the mix. So it's because it's been silenced and it's gone. So by the end of the film, you only hear the one final drone, and that's the last tower standing until it falls. So I've been told that has worked well and that it's powerful. And there's moments where some people have laughed in the film, which is good. Again, a film about technology, to be able to bring some laughter. And the fact that tell me that they've cried when watching radio towers fall. And these are people who are not necessarily radio fanatics. These are people who went to the film maybe because they're, who knows what. But and a lot of people told me they didn't, in Canada anyway, a lot of people didn't even realize this site existed, or if they did, they didn't know what it was for. It was just a landmark on the highway that they would see to be like, oh, I'm almost home. And it's amazing how many Canadians didn't even know about this site, what its purpose was, how long it had been there, and and what a shame it was torn down. So I've had many people tell me that they learned a lot from the film as well, that they didn't know this existed. And they were sad to find out about its existence only via its demise.
Radio Canada International was very popular, also here in Europe. That leads me to my last question. Are you coming with the film to Europe? If yes, when? Or will there be a DVD or Blu-ray release soon?
Well, I would definitely love to come to Europe with the film. I've submitted to several festivals. I am waiting on responses. In terms of DVD and Blu-ray, I won't be releasing until after the festival circuit, because festivals usually want to have a premiere status. They only want to show a film that hasn't been released publicly. So for the next year, I'm just waiting for responses from film festivals. And then probably in late 2017, I will release DVD and Blu-ray. But I'm definitely hoping to be coming to Europe in the winter and or spring to some festivals. It just depends on if and who it takes it. And also, anytime I screen it, whether it's in North America or Europe, I'm always trying to work with radio broadcasters, shortwave, FM, AM, to do a simulcast, because I designed the soundtrack to stand alone as a radio documentary. So anytime that it will screen, I'm hoping to have a radio broadcaster somewhere in another part of the world transmit the audio at exactly the same time, so that while people watch it in one part of the world, other people can listen in the other part. So if it should hopefully be making it to Europe, and if it does, and even if it doesn't, there will still be hopefully some transmissions, hopefully over shortwave as well, of the sound, the radio documentary version.
That was Amanda Dawn Christie with me on a Skype phone call, the woman behind the film documentary Spectres of Shortwave that is shown tonight in Sackville. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And this concludes our first program in English language of Radio, People and Stories. You can hear the repetition to Scandinavia and Northern America tomorrow, Tuesday at 2:30 UTC on 7360 kHz. Again, with a power of 100 kilowatts from Armenia. If you want to write us, drop us a line via email info@shortwaveservice.com. info@shortwaveservice.com. Thanks for tuning in. Give us your opinion, info@shortwaveservice.com, and perhaps the show won't be a one-timer, and we do somewhere in the future another edition of Radio, People and Story. My name is Christian Milling. Have a nice evening and speak to you soon.